Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, this is NATO 2020, a new podcast series pitching fresh ideas for the world's oldest military alliance. I'm your host, Terry Schultz, and I've been covering NATO for more than 10 years, so I know a lot about how the alliance has been doing things, but this podcast is about how it could be doing things differently. The Atlantic Council commissioned a series of 20 recommendations as to how the 70-year-old alliance could freshen up a bit heading into the next decade. Some of these are ideas we've heard a lot about, some are completely new. All of them are aimed at making the alliance more resilient and responsive to the threats that get more creative all the time. I'm going to be digging into those ideas with their authors. In this episode, the recommendation and the Russian veto on Georgian accession. The authors are both from the Foreign Policy Center at the Heritage Foundation. Luke Coffey is the director of the center, and Alexis Moravchik is a research associate for Russia and Eurasia. Thank you, Luke and Alexis, for coming on the show.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So let's go back in time to the Bucharest summit. I was at that summit, so I can remember being in the milieu of wondering who would get in at this summit and hearing the announcement that Georgia was not going to be one of them to get a membership action plan at that time, 2008, which would then, of course, turn out to be a really important year in a lot of not really good ways. So why don't the two of you take us back to what happened in 2008 and to why the door was shut on Georgia at that time? Or they would say left a crack open, but the Georgians very much felt like the door was shut.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that the door was it was open and then quickly shut. It was opened at the time really by George Bush, who was very keen on NATO enlargement as a way to spread stability and security and even prosperity throughout Central and Eastern Europe. He was driving this agenda for some time during his presidency. And at the Bucharest summit, he thought he had an agreement amongst the leaders of the alliance that Georgia would receive something called a membership action plan, which is the current mechanism that NATO uses to create a roadmap for entry into the alliance. And of course, NATO, as an intergovernmental security alliance, operates on consensus. I think
unanimity unanimity,
certainly unanimity. And President Bush thought he had it, and I think some other European countries had something else in mind. So when it got to the time to make these sort of announcements at Bucharest, many were caught by surprise when some countries, mainly in Western Europe, predominantly led by Germany and France, said, no, we're not going to go this far. And as a compromise, you have this wording in the Bucharest Declaration that says that someday Georgia and Ukraine will join the alliance. And this based off the membership action plan being the primary tool for them to join. But they didn't get the membership action plan. They haven't since received the membership action plan. And this led to unfortunate events. In my opinion, this led to the unfortunate event in August of 2008, which was the Russian invasion of Georgia.
That's right. They moved into Abkhazia and South Ossetia, where they remain today, basically unfettered. Alexis, do you think that Moscow read this as basically NATO abandoning Georgia, and that's what made it so easy for them 4 months later to go in and sort of appeal to the separatist feeling that had long been there?
I think that's certainly plausible, and Russia may have been, feeling threatened by that promise to Georgia to one day become part of NATO. And so, I think there could certainly be a connection put between those two events in 2008.
Luke, are you going so far as to say it's NATO's fault, or NATO could have prevented the invasion in that August?
Well, let's not forget who the aggressor was. It was Russia. Russia invaded Georgia and not the other way around. So there's only one party to blame for one country invading another one, and and subsequently occupying 1/5 of its territory. And in this case, it's Russia. Russia is to blame. Now, did the mixed signals that NATO sent at Bucharest help push Putin towards this direction? Probably. But also, I suspect that he had been planning for such an incursion, such an invasion for some time. And that's what we also saw in 2014 with Crimea. I really feel like that there is some thinking and some strategy behind this in the Kremlin. But what Russian policymakers do is they wait for that right opportunity to take advantage of a situation, and that's what we saw, I think, in August of 2008.
Alexis, do you think that if the map, as we all now know, the Membership Action Plan, would have been offered in 2008, would it have put up a roadblock in the Kremlin's mind, at least?
I think that's certainly possible. Luke actually might be able to speak a little bit more on this. He's slightly more familiar with the Membership Action Plan.
Yeah,
as a deterrent, I mean, would they have said we've got to act now because that's not in place yet? They're not moving along that road. So if we're going to do this anyway, time to do it now. Could have gone either way.
That's very possible. That could have been the situation had NATO formally granted a membership action plan to Georgia. It's always very difficult to assess these hypothetical situations, especially more than a decade from when they happened, because let's not forget, MAP is not a security guarantee. MAP is merely a tool that's used to get a country inside of the alliance. So a country having a membership action plan in itself wouldn't necessarily deter or prevent Russia. In fact, as you just alluded to, Terry, Russia could have seen a Georgian map and said, hey, we got to act now. We got to act quickly. So it could have been inevitable that in August of 2008, Russia was going to do something, and they did.
Well, and we shouldn't presume that anybody in the West would have predicted it anyway, given that we were taken by surprise in 2014, right?
Yeah, well, I remember 2014 people were saying, watch out, Georgia's next. And I was like, Georgia's next? Georgia was first.
But how about that? I mean, how quickly we forget. So I was at NATO headquarters when they said, "Oh, now we're going to really punish Russia for these August events and downsize the Russian mission at NATO," which people are always surprised to hear they even have. But yes, they do. So number of diplomats slashed, that kind of thing. But other than that, I mean, kind of wimpy. Things never did go back to business as normal, but maybe they didn't have to, in the Kremlin's mind, because it didn't stop them. Yeah,
well, exactly. And there is some revisionist history, I would say, as it pertains to the Western response to Russia's invasion of Georgia. It was often mentioned during the response by the Obama administration and some across Europe during the 2014 events with Crimea. And I would say in both, the U.S. sent some good signals, but I wouldn't necessarily say very powerful signals in 2008. Certainly not enough to deter future Russian aggression, obviously, because we had 2014 and we had Crimea. And I think that this is because policymakers at the time, certainly in 2008, certainly in the United States, we had a lot going on in Iraq. We had a lot going on in Afghanistan and in other places. And I feel like that, that Russia took advantage of, they even took advantage of the fact that there was the opening ceremony of the Beijing Olympics. In 2008, when they decided to invade, the world was occupied on the opening ceremony. So that I really feel like they had this plan in the back of their minds, and they saw the stars align, and then voila, this is what we ended up with: an invasion of Georgia and a partial occupation, which has prevented that country's progress inside of the Euro-Atlantic community.
let's go back just one more minute, just because I'm geeky like that, and remind us why Germany and France didn't want to let Georgia in. I mean, we should also point out that the map requires a lot of, primarily internal reform by the country itself. So, I mean, Georgia also has a responsibility if it wants a map. It's not that it's something that's given to you like a gift. It's something that you're measured as to whether you're ready to get the new system to measure you more, right?
That's right. And also, getting a map doesn't mean membership. It doesn't guarantee membership. You have to fulfill a whole bunch of criteria. And that's why many were puzzled, or continue to be puzzled, as to why NATO will not grant map to Georgia, because it doesn't guarantee membership. It just creates a more formal process for Georgia to someday join the alliance. I think in 2008, there was a lot of, with France and Germany, the relationship across the Atlantic with the Bush administration wasn't the greatest.
Was that what it was?
Well, no. I think there's several parts of this. I think, the frosty relations over Iraq that were still lingering. And I mean, look, we see relations today between leaders in the U.S. and Europe, and the situation in 2008 looks like a high watermark. But nevertheless, we shouldn't forget that there was this tension that did exist between the Bush administration and certainly in Germany, and that and there's a certain hesitancy by many European countries to take on new members that might be seen as antagonizing Russia, because they have a very comfortable, cozy, oftentimes based on economic relationship with Russia.
But whose backyard is this? That's a bit short-sighted, isn't it? I mean, now you've got another frozen conflict in your own backyard, Europe.
Well, exactly. It is very short-sighted. But at the time, they were more concerned about the trade relationship, the energy relationship with Russia, not trying to antagonize Vladimir Putin. But
well,
as
hello,
I said,
2020 as well.
What's that?
I said, hello, 2020. Here we
go. Oh, exactly. I mean, it hasn't stopped since 2008, and arguably it went on before 2008. But going back, I know MAP is not the topic of our paper, but it is important to address this issue. I really think the whole MAP, Membership Action Plan concept, has passed its sell-by date.
That should have been another recommendation there, Luke. You should have pitched it as one of your, bright ideas for the alliance.
I was limited by word count. I have a lot of ideas, but
I get that.
I had to stick to the rules. But I really feel like that it's time to find a new system, a new way, a new mechanism to get countries inside NATO, because Membership Action Plan worked really well for all the easy cases. The Polands, the Hungarys, the Slovakia, Czech Republic, whatever. I mean, it worked for those cases. But now, the remaining aspirant countries have very complex situations, whether it's Bosnia and Herzegovina with Republika Srpska and the whole issue surrounding immovable defense equipment not being controlled by the central government, or with Ukraine and Crimea, of course, and Georgia with the partial occupation. We got to find a more tailored approach. Maybe it could be called Tailored Action Plan. I don't know. Where you heard it here first. Tailored Action Plan, where NATO tries to come up with a very specifically focused roadmap for each remaining aspirant country based on their own unique situation, and then move forward this way. Because right now, MAP becomes a political football. And domestically in Georgia, before a NATO summit or during a NATO summit, if they don't get a map, then the opposition cries foul. The government says we tried everything we can. And then Russia sits there laughing and they say, look, NATO doesn't really want you. You can't even get a map. So right. To remove that from the equation, in my opinion.
So there, now after we've let you make this NATO 21 2020, let's go ahead and go on to your old paper.
Yes.
And bring Alexis back in here. So moving on to where we are now, Georgia does sit at every summit and wonder, I mean, some more than others, obviously, when it's on the agenda, as it, as it regularly is. And they wonder, and they literally ask, and you can see their, the journalists' hearts breaking. Why aren't we getting this? Because when you look at Georgian contributions to NATO, they are on the front lines. I believe they might even be the first. I mean, they are up among the top countries with casualties in Afghanistan. They basically had an entire base wiped out at one point. They contribute everything they think they can. So whether you call it a map or anything else, what is holding up NATO now to let Georgia in? And, you've got this idea about Article 6, which we'll talk about in more detail, but talk about the situation where we are now and why Georgia sits there still locked out meeting after meeting.
Well, Terry, if I may, I'm just going to back up a little bit and talk about why Georgia should even be in NATO, because
good point.
It's a very, important matter, and that's why we're all here today. But really, it's important that Georgia becomes a member of NATO for 3 reasons. And like you mentioned, yes, Georgia has contributed thousands of troops in Iraq and Afghanistan, and Georgia today still has 850 troops in Afghanistan. And that is a significant number. Georgia has also contributed peacekeepers to the Balkans and Africa. And continually, the United States and Georgia cooperate militarily. The U.S. has sold Javelin missiles and Stingers to Georgia. And even from a young age, the U.S. and Georgia cooperate militarily. I mean, there have been in the past at least a few Georgians who have graduated from West Point. So I think it's really neat to see how our partnership has come along and our alliance. And then also, Georgia sits at an important crossroads geographically. It's right in between Europe and Asia, and that's a strategic point because there are oil and gas pipelines there, and there's a lot of different transit that runs through there. So that would definitely boost the NATO alliance in that way. And also, despite political turmoil at home on the domestic front in Georgia, Georgia remains a beacon of hope for the Eurasia region. It has seen peaceful transfers of power with each election over the past several years, and it has free and fair elections. And it also has instituted economic reforms that really serve as a good example for the rest of the Eurasia region.
So when they plead time after time, what more do you want from us? What more is it that NATO wants from them?
Luke, do you want to take that one?
Yeah. Well, that's the $1 million question. Basically, there are countries that don't want to take on an additional security burden. There are some countries that don't want to unnecessarily, in their minds at least, unnecessarily provoke Russia. And at the end of the day, it only takes one, because, as we discussed, how decision making takes place inside NATO, and this is the same problem that the European Union faces as well, with something as I would argue as straightforward as sanctions against Lukashenko and other officials in Belarus responsible for the crackdown on the protesters, where one country, in this case it was Cyprus, was able temporarily, until enough pressure was put on them, to block straightforward sanctions. So when you have an issue
over nothing having to do with the sanctions themselves,
exactly nothing at all. This was purely an issue based off it matters in the Eastern Med, not matters in Northeastern Europe. And in the NATO context, we've also seen this with Hungary and Ukraine. Hungary blocking the NATO Ukraine commission from meeting over language restrictions in Ukraine that affect like 40,000 ethnic Hungarians living in a tiny part of Western Ukraine, right? And this has blocked cooperation. So it doesn't take much.
That's your idea 22. And the reflection group just rejected the idea of abolishing unanimity. So
yeah, and I do sympathize with that because anytime you make a decision to put, troops into harm's way, then I think you do need some political, agreement and political consensus. However, I do see the frustration that, a country like Georgia or Ukraine has when it comes to matters like this, that everyone has to agree. And they often use a bilateral dispute with another member state or another organization as a way to stop decision making.
But that's not really the case here, is it? They just keep telling Georgia it's not ready.
Yeah, well, that's the official sort of excuse, but I think in reality there are countries like Germany who don't want to antagonize Russia.
But NATO and Montenegro and North Macedonia were allowed in. I mean, and Georgia just feels this like a stab in the heart. What if you wanted Montenegro?
The problem is neither of those two examples, and in the case of North Macedonia, that was a very complex issue that almost, in my opinion, descended into the absurdity when it came to the bilateral dispute with Greece and the name. But I'm glad it worked out. But they don't have 20% of their territory occupied by Russia. And that's the problem right here, right? There are countries that believe that bringing Georgia into NATO would automatically mean a war with Russia because of the presence of Russian military forces inside of Georgia's borders. And that gets us to really the main point of our proposal.
So, yeah, and let's get to that, because one interesting point, I have to say that I was really fascinated by Article 6, because we only count to 5 most of the time at NATO. I mean, we talk about Article 5 constantly. We talk about 3 every now and then, 4 pretty frequently, but 6?
Yeah.
Tell me more.
Well, Article 6 basically tells you where Article 5 applies. And it's important. It's an important article, not just in the context of this debate with NATO or with Georgia joining NATO, but also about NATO's area of responsibility and what NATO should be doing. NATO doesn't have to be everywhere in the world doing everything, but Article 6 says that Article 5 applies in the North Atlantic area north of the Tropic of Cancer. And then it puts some other restrictions about islands and, this and that in there. And basically, our proposal is that you would amend Article 6, and you would do this amendment to the 1949 North Atlantic Treaty during the accession protocol process. The accession protocol process is basically a legal document that is passed and ratified by each legislative body in each member state before a country can join. It basically amends the treaty to say, okay, this is a list of NATO members, and we're adding another one to it. It's really as simple as that. But you can amend the whole treaty using the accession protocol process, and you could amend Article 6 to say that all of Georgia would be invited to join NATO. All of Georgia, as recognized by the international community, which includes Abkhazia and the Shkin Valley or South Ossetia region, however you want to call it, includes that. So all of Georgia will join NATO. However, only the regions not occupied by Russia will get the Article 5 security guarantee, and that you would stress that this would be a temporary measure only. Until the occupation ends in a peaceful way. And there are plenty of examples of countries being inside NATO and not having all of their territory covered under Article 5. I mean, for us in America, Hawaii or Guam or Wake Island, for example, would not get Article 5 protection according to Article 6, the way Article 6 is worded. The Falkland Islands and Britain is another example, Reunion Island and France. There are quite a few examples. So this isn't unprecedented to have a country inside NATO, but not all of that country being protected by NATO's Article 5.
Okay, technically I get the comparison, but Alexis, as a student of Russia, you know that it's significantly different. Nobody's, saying that they need to go protect their language minorities on Guam, or Hawaii. So how likely is it that Russia would say, this is now at our borders? This is if Georgia were to be able to overcome the block and even get the map, how likely is Russia to say, now you've really done it? Now this is directly threatening us, because they even still do it with the Baltics, just with having what is now, a few 100,000 in Estonia, for example. Russia, Putin still threatens every now and then that he needs to come in and protect those Russian speakers. So,
yeah, that's definitely true, Terry. I think Russia could come in and say, oh, these are our people in a sense, and we need to protect them. But legally, those territories do belong to Georgia, and they're internationally recognized as part of Georgia.
Legally, schmegally, so is Crimea.
That is true. Well, I don't know. I think the international community has the much larger advantage over Russia in this case.
Russia has a lot going on right now. It's had some recent setbacks in Syria and in Libya. It has the whole situation in Belarus to worry about. It has an ever ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine and Donbass. The occupation of Crimea is costing the state coffers billions of rubles every year in terms of new infrastructure and pensions and everything else. And it just inherited another problem in the South Caucasus over Nagorno-Karabakh. It now has, a peacekeeping presence.
Inherited is a pretty passive verb.
Well, I don't think Putin really wanted this problem to erupt right now. I think he has benefited from this. He took advantage of the situation. But I think if all things were being equal, he would have preferred not to have this problem to deal with in 2020. Because
we've
of
all had
COVID,
enough.
Yeah, exactly. The COVID situation in Russia, the drop in oil prices, the economic situation. It's just another major problem that Russia is having to deal with. So, it remains to be seen how Russia would react if NATO invited Georgia to join under this proposal. But then again, there doesn't seem to be any other better ideas on how to get Georgia inside of the alliance. And the reason why this idea works for Georgia and wouldn't work for Ukraine, for example, is that Georgia has a non-use of force pledge to get the territories back. This is agreed by all political parties in Georgia. It's a stated government policy that they will not use military force to get the territories back. And of course, in Ukraine, weekly people are being killed or wounded fighting on the front lines. So that's why the situation is a lot different from that in Ukraine.
Yeah, it's truly frozen in the sense that
Yes.
nothing is moving. I mean, people might be surprised to learn there are actually fences inside Georgia where somebody, who could walk across the field no longer can, because part of that's now claimed by Russia. But anyway, let me ask though why there is not more appetite inside NATO, because clearly Georgia is in a critical location also for security for Europe. And right there on the border, it would seem that they would, as they said with Montenegro and North Macedonia, to stabilize the Balkans. I don't know why you wouldn't want to stabilize that area with Georgia in it. And to that end, NATO has stepped up exercises with Georgia, and Russia sort of squawks every time it happens, but doesn't really do anything. But why is there no appetite when there was an appetite in the Balkans? And I mean, we've talked about the geopolitical reasons, but if you're talking about strictly geographical reasons, wouldn't it make sense to invite them?
I think there's not a lot of appetite because NATO is simply scared that it might provoke Russia, and there might be a full-blown World War III breaking out. And so I think NATO is honestly a bit skittish. They don't want to provoke Russia in that way, and Russia has been provoked in the past, and we want to avoid that if possible.
How long would Georgia be expected to keep hanging on? I mean, this is clearly one of their most desired, accomplishments for the country. But as they say, we keep sending soldiers, our soldiers keep dying, we keep, upgrading our own militaries. What would be the risk that Georgia just says, all right, we're sick of it, we're done, we don't need you, NATO?
I think there's possibly a very small percentage of that happening, but I think Georgia is still very much interested in joining NATO, and it was promised to them 12 years ago. I think they're likely to still keep hanging on for several years to come. I don't see that appetite to join NATO decreasing anytime soon.
So your paper talks about the possibility that if everyone else decided they were ready to offer the maps to Georgia, that Germany and France in particular might still be against it. Would that just be for the same old reasons as in 2008? And has the US provided enough leadership on this?
No, there hasn't been enough US leadership on this issue. And I really think if there was genuine US leadership on this specific proposal, over time we could build a coalition inside of NATO, because there are countries inside NATO who would like Georgia to join. We could build a coalition of like-minded members that can over time put pressure on France and Germany and any other country inside NATO that might be against this idea. But this also has to come from Georgia themselves. The Georgians have to say that they are open to this idea. And it's politically, this is a very difficult thing for Georgian politicians to do.
The Article
because
6,
it can be
the Article
this
6
whole
thing.
idea of, the whole idea of amending Article 6 to allow Georgia to join, but not all of its internationally recognized territory to be under the protection of Article 5 is controversial. I don't pretend that it's not. And
Sure.
Russia can actually use this for disinformation. And that's why this is why NATO and Georgia need to work together to come up with a public relations campaign to explain to the Georgian people that this would only be a temporary measure, that there are countries inside NATO today that don't have all of their territory under Article 5 protection, and that someday when the conflict of the occupation ends peacefully, then all of Georgia's territory will fall under Article 5 protection. But until that point, if you want to get into the alliance, if you want to get some of the benefits of being a NATO member, we're going to have to think creatively to get you across the finish line, and we're going to have to amend Article 6 to not include your occupied regions.
So it would feel like a concession to Russia.
Well, it wouldn't be a concession because it wouldn't change this. It doesn't change the status quo. I mean, these regions remain occupied, and they would remain occupied under this scenario. But the rest of Georgia would get NATO's Article 5 protection. So I think it would be overall, it would be a huge benefit to Georgia. I get a lot of criticism about this idea because people are suggesting that I'm asking Georgia to give up on these territories, and I'm not doing that at all. And in fact, I often say, if NATO is asking Georgia to either join the alliance or give up on 1/5 of its territory, I would say, no, thank you, NATO. Because Georgia's been around for about 2,000 years before NATO, and it'll be around for about 2,000 more after NATO, I'm guessing.
After NATO, that's our next series.
Oh, yeah. So in the year of like 4,000, according to my scenario here. So it's not about asking Georgia to give up on its territory. NATO's not asking that. We're not asking that. All we're saying is we need to be pragmatic, we need to be flexible, we need to think creatively if we want Georgia to get inside of the alliance.
And how realistic do you think that this will happen? Has this been suggested to Georgia? As I said, I haven't heard talk about this here at NATO headquarters and at summits. So is this something that has been suggested and rejected already, and maybe will come up again as Georgia gets even more desperate?
Well, privately, Georgian officials say that they see this as being the only way into the alliance. Publicly, they will not say anything about it because they're concerned about the public backlash or the disinformation from Russia. And this was especially true in the last 18 months or so leading up to the elections in Georgia. Now that the elections are over, and there's a fresh administration coming into the United States, maybe there's an opportunity here to throw this idea on the table. because if, I'm all ears. We would love to hear a better idea to get Georgia in NATO. But no one has been able to present a responsible, a realistic and reasonable path for Georgia to join the alliance.
That's interesting. Well, like you said, maybe with the Biden administration, it's time for this approach, and maybe Georgia will be more willing, and Moscow will be more willing to be amenable to making this work. Not that Moscow should have a vote on this, because as NATO likes to reiterate, no country should have a veto on a potential ally coming in.
Exactly.
But it still works out that way.
And this proposal would deny Russia its veto. Right now, Russia's worked out the perfect formula to stop Euro-Atlantic integration, whether it's NATO or the European Union. All they have to do is invade and partially occupy. Whether you're Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia, your Euro-Atlantic integration is eventually stopped. If we can deny Russia that veto, that power, that influence, then we have a whole new dynamic when it comes to Euro-Atlantic integration.
Well, that's a very upbeat note on which to stop. So we'll wrap it up there. Thank you so much, Luke Coffey and Alexis Moravchik, for telling us more about your recommendation that NATO end the Russian veto on Georgian accession. You can find all 20 ideas at atlanticcouncil.org. Tell us what you think, and on Twitter at #StrongerWithAllies. Thanks so much for being with me. Join me next time.